There is a long, quiet pause that stretches across nearly 10,000 years between the end of the Ice Age and the rise of the first civilizations. A mist-filled era where history had no writing, no cities, no memories carved into stone. But people lived there. They walked across lands that are now buried beneath the sea, watching coastlines shift in ways no language could ever fully describe. They carried fear, hope, and an instinct for survival in a world that never stopped changing. Today, all we have left are fragments of tools, a few traces of bone, scattered ash, and faint legends about places that slipped beneath the waves. And from within those empty spaces, a quiet realization begins to rise. History did not begin when civilization appeared. It began in everything that dissolved into water, into soil, and into the human mind. To understand our world, we have to step back into that stillness, into the stretch of time where the past no longer speaks, yet somehow it still breathes. If you stand before the North Sea on a windless morning, staring into the endless stretch of silver-grey water, it is almost impossible to believe that beneath those waves once lay a vast landscape of forests, lakes, and soft rolling valleys reaching all the way to the horizon. Doggerland once existed, not as a legend, not as a vague sketch in ancient imagination, but as a real place where people walked, lit fires, and lived out their entire lives in the quiet of the post-glacial world. To speak the name Doggerland is to call back a world that was once vividly present, then disappeared from the map, faster than nature could erase its memory. Doggerland once linked Britain to the Netherlands and Denmark, forming a landmass so broad that if you had lived 8,000 to 10,000 years ago, you could have walked from Britain to continental Europe without ever suspecting that your path would one day sink beneath the sea. Ancient rivers flowed gently through marshes and light woodlands, carrying more of the warmth of the earth than the chill of the ocean. Deer, aurochs, and even some of the last surviving mammoths wandered across that plain, leaving footprints now buried tens of meters below the waves. Across that wide landscape lived Mesolithic communities, hunting and gathering groups who moved with the seasons and the herds. They built camps along riverbanks, searched for shells in muddy flats, and watched the night sky as though it spoke a language they understood more deeply than we imagine. They shaped tools from stone, antler, and bone, tended fires even in cold winds, chose their dwellings by the sun and by the wind. But most importantly, they were living on land that was changing a little more every single day. Doggerland did not vanish in a single moment. As the polar ice slowly melted, the sea rose with a quiet persistence. Low valleys flooded first, plains became marshland, and forests dissolved into brackish water. Across generations, familiar hunting trails were swallowed by the rising sea until only a shimmering surface remained, a signal that something vast was approaching. For the Mesolithic people, this was not simply nature shifting. It was life itself being rearranged. Groups living near the coast retreated to higher ground, abandoning older shelters to the encroaching water. They had no concept of sea level rise, but they felt it the way we feel the passing of seasons, small steps, yet certain ones. They told their children stories of the great open lands they once crossed, of places now unseen. Slowly, Doggerland transformed from geography into memory. Today, stone axes, spear points, and fragments of bone caught accidentally in fishermen's nets surface like late messages from an older world. They force us to ask, what was that place? Who lived there? And what did they experience before humanity's earliest civilizations ever appeared? Doggerland, then, is not merely the land submerged beneath the North Sea. It is the opening chapter of a much larger story, one about Earth's constant transformations, humanity's ability to adapt, and the homelands that now rest under quiet layers of sediment. When we stand at the edge of the North Sea today and look out across the muted grey water, it is hard not to feel that beneath those waves lies a memory being kept by time itself. And it is from Doggerland that we realize our exploration of the world's lost lands has only just begun. Beneath the waters of our present planet are regions larger, older, and deeper, places where geology and human memory once touched, where the story of the 10,000 years before civilization is still waiting to be told. When Doggerland still lay above the water and the waves of the North Sea had not yet arrived, it was more than a strip of land linking the shores of Europe. It was a complete world, a place where Mesolithic people lived within an open and endless landscape. To imagine life on those plains now drowned beneath salt water, we have to let go of our familiar images of streets, rooftops, or stone walls. We must return to a time when every sound was the wind, the movement of animals, the brush of grass against a person's leg, a time when every rhythm of life depended on sunlight, on rainy seasons, and on the quiet rise and fall of the new moon. Doggerland in those days was a land full of vitality. Grassland stretched so far that the horizon blurred into pale mist, where reindeer herds moved in long, flowing lines, where aurochs crossed valleys with the force of the earth breathing, and where red deer lifted their heads at even the faintest shift in the air. Perhaps on foggy mornings a person standing alone on the plain felt small, but never lost, because nature then was not something to conquer, but the very environment they lived alongside. The presence of Mesolithic people blended into the landscape softly. They lived in small groups, bonded tightly like extended families, sharing long hunting days and freezing nights. They chose campsites near water, near the edge of forests, and along the paths of migrating animals. We can picture them sitting around the fire, red light warming sun-darkened faces, wind threading through their stories. Stories never written down, only carried by voices and memory. Their lives were simple, but never shallow. Modest rituals, a whispered thanks after a successful hunt, a few carved marks on wood or stone, revealed the reverence they held for the land. Mesolithic people did not try to control nature, they listened to it and lived within its terms. That stillness survives now only in small artifacts found by accident. An antler spear point, a bone hook polished smooth, a stone flake sharp enough to nick a fingertip. These are the fading echoes of a voice time has nearly erased. Charred wood discovered in sediment cores beneath the North Sea shows that small camps once stood there, families sheltered in frames of branches and animal hides, their fires once flickered brightly, their smoke rising into the sky before dissolving. No one knows how many footsteps crossed that soil, how many laughs, how many winters passed through that place. But each fragment of burnt wood lifted from the seafloor whispers the same message: we were here. What makes Doggerland extraordinary is not only that it once existed, but the feeling of an entire world people lived in before the sea reclaimed it. That world was simple, yet layered, a depth you cannot measure with instruments, only sense when a stone axe, appears in a fisherman's net. When someone hauls up such a tool among the catch, they are pulling up an entire lifetime held under water for thousands of years. To think that beneath the North Sea today lie the fields where ancestors once walked, the paths they followed behind migrating herds, the open ground where children once played. That is what makes Doggerland a doorway into a time when humans and nature were not yet separate. And from that peaceful way of life, we understand that what sinks is not always an ending. Doggerland, in its silence, opens the first chapter of the story of the world's vanished lands. It reminds us that behind every disappearance, there are larger, older, deeper worlds. Places people once called home, once departed, and once carried in memory across countless generations. If Doggerland was once a world of forests and grasslands, then the final generations who lived there witnessed something none of them could ever forget. The horizon began to change. It was not the shift of seasons nor strange storms, but the quiet advance of the sea, a force moving inch by inch, never stopping, as if it were redrawing the borders of the human world. And then came those rare moments in Earth's history, when the change was no longer slow, when just a few lifetimes were enough to see land dissolve into water. In the language of geology, this was meltwater pulse 1b, a sudden, intense burst of melting roughly 11,500 years ago, when massive ice sheets in the northern hemisphere fractured and spilled into the ocean. Sea levels rose by several meters within only a few centuries, turning every low-lying region fragile. But for Mesolithic people there was no concept of global ice melt. They only knew that dry places became marshland, familiar hunting grounds filled with reeds, and eventually stretched into waters no one could cross. Maybe one morning they realized the reindeer herd that returned each year had not come back. Maybe they walked to the old sandbar and saw the water touching higher than anyone remembered. Maybe a migration trail turned into a deep pool after an odd season of rain. These signs did not explain anything directly, but they stirred a quiet unease, the kind only primal intuition can feel. Yet that meltwater surge was not the final blow. Around 8,200 years ago, off the coast of Norway, a massive section of the seabed collapsed and plunged thousands of meters downward, triggering the Storegga tsunami. Its waves may have reached 20 meters high, a wall of water racing toward the lowlands of northern Europe. We do not know how many people witnessed that moment, but we can imagine them looking toward the horizon and seeing the sea rise upright, curling with a power unlike anything told across generations. The wave crashed into the plains, carrying away trees, animals, and the places where people once lived. A portion of Doggerland may have vanished in a single day, fast enough that the generation born afterward grew up with an entirely different map. For Mesolithic people, this was not just a natural disaster, it was the breaking of their world. Hills that once served as hunting lookouts became isolated islands. Rivers that meandered across broad plains disappeared beneath dark water. Paths they had walked their entire lives turned into the cold seafloor. Perhaps they stood on higher ground, gazing at a place that had once been home, now only a silver ripple fading into memory. Today, meltwater pulse 1b and the Storegga slide are described through charts, ice cores, and computer models. But those lines and curves were once real human lives. Each meter of rising water was a piece of memory lost. Each rushing wave was a story that would never be told again. To them, this was not a geological event. It was the day they lost their homeland. When archaeologists lift fragments of charred wood, broken spear points, or bones washed from deep water sediments, they are touching that very moment, the moment that forced people to leave. Each artifact is not just evidence. It is an acknowledgement that Doggerland once lived, once breathed, and once belonged to humankind before the sea erased it from the surface. What makes the story of Doggerland even more thought-provoking is that it was not an exception. Over tens of thousands of years, Earth has repeatedly lifted certain lands and pulled others down. People moved with those changes, adapted, left, and carried the memory of places that no longer exist. The lost continents are not only legends, they are the planet's natural rhythm. Through the eyes of geology, Doggerland's disappearance was inevitable. But through the pulse of human experience, it was a sorrowful chapter in our long story, a chapter known only through a few fragments drawn from the sea floor and the faint echoes of a distant past. And from that disappearance, our journey continues southward to a land even larger, greener, and more vibrant than Doggerland, a land that also withdrew from the Earth's surface. Post-glacial legends will lead us there. Sundayland, a continent that once stood as a world of its own before the ocean claimed it. When Doggerland disappeared beneath the rising waves, the sea did more than take away plains and forests. It took the land's language as well. The words that once described fields, rivers, and familiar paths suddenly meant nothing when the earth they named was gone. The only thing the sea could not take was what people carried in their memory. And from that memory, across many generations, stories were born. Stories told beside firelight in the long nights of the post-Ice Age world, when everything was passed on only by voice. We can imagine it. After tsunamis, after decades of slow but certain sea level rise, small groups were forced to leave their homeland behind. There were no maps, no concept of large-scale migration. Only the growing feeling that the West, the place where the sun set, was drifting farther away. Elders told the children, the plains were once so wide you could walk forever and never reach the end. Yet now only a grey sheet of water stretched across the horizon. They spoke of forests where deer once sheltered, of riverbanks where flint was gathered, and of the moment the sea stood up and crossed the boundary like a living being stepping forward. At first, these stories were simply the memories of one generation. But as the children grew up without ever seeing the original land, they unconsciously added fear, imagination, and details no one could verify anymore. Thus, memory slowly transformed into myth. As the ice retreated across Europe, the groups leaving Doggerland met others, people from Scandinavia, from the region that is now Germany, from the edges of the northern glaciers. They did not share the same languages, yet they carried a strangely similar motif. The sea had swallowed the plains, the western land had once been vast, a world had sunk beneath the water. From that motif, many later legends emerged. Tales of lands consumed by the sea, of the old world drifting away, of homelands now resting at the bottom of the ocean. As these groups continued south and east, the stories moved with them, taking root as new mythologies in the lands where they settled. What matters is that post-Ice Age people did not ignore nature. They listened to the sky, remembered the rivers, watched the animals, and saw great environmental shifts as signals, not merely physical events, but reminders, warnings, something beyond their understanding yet deeply tied to instinct. Changes like these were not easily forgotten. They became part of identity. And then, as they travelled farther south and southeast, they reached warmer lands where forests returned in thick canopies and great rivers split the continent into wide branching systems. There they found fertile plains stretching out to a hazy horizon. Some stayed, others continued on. But the memory of Doggerland's ancient plains followed them quietly like a shadow. To understand why their memory of Doggerland led them into a new legend, we must look at the bond between people and land. When a plain disappears, it does not only vanish from the map, it vanishes from spiritual life. A memory seeks a new home, another land vast enough, rich enough, familiar enough to hold the longing. That land lay to the southeast, thousands of kilometers away, much larger, much older, far more abundant. Today we see it only as scattered chains of islands, but when those post-Ice Age migrants arrived, they must have felt they had rediscovered something deeply familiar, great rivers branching like veins of the earth, valleys unfolding toward the horizon, deep green forests draping across plains that once stretched hundreds of kilometers. They did not know the name of this place, but we do. Sundayland. As the memory of Doggerland faded into myth, that very memory opened a doorway that led them to Sunderland, not just through migration of their feet, but through the invisible journey of longing for a world they had lost, a vast, fertile expanse, like a natural kingdom that once stretched through the Ice Age. And here, the story of Earth's vanished continents shifts into another chapter, broader, deeper, and far more mysterious. Doggerland is the beginning, but Sunderland is the doorway into the rest of Earth's legend. If we look at a map of Southeast Asia today, we see only scattered island chains glimmering like broken jade pieces on a blue sea. Borneo, Java, Sumatra, the Malay Peninsula, narrow straits, shallow waters, glowing turquoise from above. But if we turn time back 14 or 18,000 years, that picture disappears. In its place rises something immense, a true landmass, more than 1.5 million square kilometers wide, rivaling the great superplains that would later support entire civilizations. This was Sunderland. Not a chain of islands, not the edge of a continent, but a continuous world. A soft, sprawling land stretching toward the horizon, with enormous rivers weaving across it like living veins, the ancient Mahakam, the ancient Musi, the Sunda river system, and countless tributaries connecting dense forests with fertile plains. Some of these rivers were so long you could travel for days without reaching their end, the land so vast that standing in the center of Sunderland back then, you would see no ocean at all, only a hazy line of green on every horizon. When we say Sunderland was 1.5 million square kilometers, it is not a dry number. It represents a world large enough to sustain thousands of generations of people, animals, and forests, large enough to carry stories that today survive only as faint fragments, yet still make us feel as though we are standing before a forgotten chapter of humanity. Imagine this. The area we now call the Java Sea was once a massive valley where ancient elephants, wild cattle, deer, and great cats roamed freely. The South China Sea was a wide plain connecting Vietnam with Borneo. The Strait of Malacca was a great river, not the narrow waterway dividing two landmasses as it is now. Even Singapore was not an island, but a small rise in the middle of a sprawling plain. Everything we know about Sunderland tells us it was not merely a vast land, it was one of the most fertile regions humans ever lived in. Tropical forests stretched endlessly. Grasslands flowed into broad valleys. Deep, calm rivers formed natural corridors. Riverbanks large enough to host hundreds of people during hunting seasons lined the landscape. And across all of this, a warm climate supported life from its simplest to its most powerful forms. For this reason, many researchers believe Sunderland may have been one of the great migration centers of humanity. If Doggerland was a passageway into Europe, Sunderland was where people moved downward, settled, expanded, and from there spread across the Pacific Islands, the Indian Ocean, and East Asia. What remains in modern human DNA, the branching paths, overlapping genetic signatures, suggests Sunderland once acted as a massive crossroads carved through time. Because Sunderland was so large, rich and diverse, we must consider a natural possibility. It may have supported early forms of social organization, what we might call pre-civilization. Not cities of stone like Mesopotamia or Egypt, but large, stable communities that perhaps practiced seasonal cycles, crafted sophisticated tools, and exchanged goods through long routes. The forests and rivers of Sunderland offered the perfect environment for human complexity to grow. When we stand before the Shigir idol, a 12,000-year-old wooden sculpture from Siberia with designs so intricate that archaeologists were stunned, we understand that humans of that age were far from simple. So with Sunderland's immense resources and stable climate, could it have produced similar achievements, or perhaps something even greater? One thing is certain, the scale and fertility of this land make it a strong candidate for a cultural centre, at least in potential. And when archaeologists discover traces of ancient rivers beneath the Java Sea, they are touching the arteries of a world that vanished long ago. But at the height of its abundance, Sunderland carried a fate no lowland can escape during a warming world, the destiny of sinking Earth. As the climate warmed and polar ice began to retreat, sea levels rose metre by metre, decade by decade. Northern forests turned to wetlands, rivers lost their channels, and the sea slowly pushed into the heart of Sunderland, as if trying to erase everything that had ever existed there. Most of Sunderland did not disappear in a single day like a dramatic disaster. It vanished over thousands of years. Yet for those who lived there, the change was not slow at all. They felt it through every generation. Some moved to higher ground, some travelled west into India, some journeyed east into the Philippines and the Pacific, and with every step they carried the memory of a vast, generous land, a memory that over time turned into legend. Doggerland is a reminder. Sunderland is the evidence. What happens next is not only the story of a rising sea, but the story of a great human migration and the mysteries it left behind. When we look at the shallow waters of the Java Sea and the South China Sea today, it feels as though we are staring at a picture whose most important lines have been erased. Because beneath that turquoise surface lies more than sand and seafloor. There are traces of ancient highways, rivers that once served as the centers of life, places where thousands of years ago our ancestors walked, rested, and began their journeys toward new lands. The rivers of Sunderland, before the sea swallowed them, were the pillars of its ecosystems and the first true corridors of migration. They did not only carry water, they carried movement, encounters, and the stories of small communities living in the post-Ice Age world. When we reconstruct the seafloor using modern sonar technology, the deep channels appear like soft cuts across ancient Earth. Each channel is an old river, each widening, each branching point, is a riverbank where humans once lit their fires. And it was these ancient rivers that turned Sunderland into one of humanity's greatest migration crossroads. Nowhere else in that era held such a dense network of waterways. From the heart of Sunderland, people could travel north into mainland Southeast Asia, south into Java and Bali, west into the Malay Peninsula, or east across higher ridges toward the Philippines and beyond. Every river was a pathway, every pathway a doorway to new journeys. Archaeology has revealed abundant evidence that humans lived in this region very early. Sites near Nia Cave in Borneo, Liang Bua in Flores, and coastal areas of Vietnam all show footprints of populations belonging to the same vast network. This could have only happened if they lived on a continuous landmass, Sunderland itself. When we find expertly polished axes far ahead of their time, or animal bones with cut marks showing organized hunting, we realize Sunderland was not just a shelter, it was a place of development. And the rivers, like giant libraries, recorded everything in layers of silt, now buried beneath tens of meters of water. But Sunderland's importance is revealed not only through archaeology. Genetics, with its quiet precision, tells the same story. Many modern populations in Southeast Asia, East Asia, South Asia, and even across the Pacific carry genetic signatures that point back to a large ancestral population living in Sunderland. These patterns overlap and braid together as if to say that a crucial part of humanity's journey once passed through this land. When the first people left Sunderland, they carried more than Mesolithic survival skills. They carried cultural memory, early forms of language, and habits shaped over thousands of years of living close together. This is why so many distant Pacific island groups still share surprising similarities, weaving patterns, boat designs, storytelling structures, even hints of linguistic alignment. Sundaland, in a way, was a cultural convergence point long before humans built nations or cities. It was like an ancestral homeland where people learned to adapt to tropical forests, water, long monsoon seasons, and from there expanded outward across the world. Geologists refer to Sunderland's ancient rivers as the river basins of memory because they exist not only in the landscape, but also in DNA and culture. The strangest part is that despite lying underwater for thousands of years, they remain clearly visible. From satellites, you can see a dark streak running beneath the Java Sea, the main river that once sustained an entire region. When this land submerged, those enormous rivers, once the meeting places, the trade routes, the lifelines, were locked beneath the water like chapters of a book suddenly closed. But the people of Sunderland did not vanish with them. They continued on, they spread outward, and through their migrations they carried the story of the old land, a story we now read only through fragments of archaeology and through the flow of genetics within ourselves. The rivers of our ancestors no longer run across the Earth's surface, but they still run through history. They connect Doggerland, Beringia, Lemuria, and every tale of lands swallowed by the sea. And these silent rivers beneath the water paved the way for an even greater transformation, a chapter no land in that era could escape, the chapter of sinking when the ocean began to redraw the map of the world. By understanding the rivers of our ancestors, we move closer to the truth that Sunderland, vast, rich, and thriving, could not escape its fate. And from here, the story opens into one of the most dramatic natural shifts in Earth's history. the moment sea levels rose 120 meters and Sunderland was completely consumed. There was a moment in Earth's history when the world map we know today was only a newer version of an older world that had already disappeared. If we stood on the top of a hill in Sunderland 12,000 years ago and looked out, we would have seen plains stretching all the way to where the sky touched the earth. Ancient rivers flowed like immense ribbons, and rainforests spread so far that a human being became nothing more than a single dot in nature's vast canvas. But then year by year, what once belonged to the land slowly began to belong to the sea. At the end of the Ice Age, the ice began melting faster than at any other time before. Massive ice sheets, thousands of meters thick, from Greenland, Canada, Northern Europe, Siberia, all melted and slid into the oceans like colossal white rivers. As the ice dissolved, the oceans swelled, and sea levels did not rise just a few meters. They rose by 120 meters in a few thousand years, enough to redraw the shape of entire continents. This rise was not loud. It was not a single flood or one catastrophic tsunami. It was the rise of the sea in a way humans could not stop, could not predict, could not even name. A slow but certain advance, the long exhale of the planet. Each decade, the water crept a little farther. Each century, familiar lands dissolved like mist. And over several millennia, the Sunderland that once spread across more than 1.5 million square kilometers shrank like a painting blurred by water. The low valleys disappeared first. Hunting routes vanished. Riverbanks turned into marshland. And finally, the marshes turned into sea. One generation passed, and the places where they had played as children became silent water. 2 generations passed, and the forests where they once hunted survived only as memory. 3 generations passed, and most of the land their ancestors had known was gone beneath the darkening ocean. What makes Sunderland's disappearance so profound is not just its scale, but its impact on the people. They did not simply lose land, they lost social structures, shelter, stable food sources, and even their own sense of identity. They became refugees of a continent, forced to leave not because of war, but because the planet itself had changed shape. For them, sea level rise was not an idea. It was a sight unfolding before their eyes. The water reached the base of an ancient tree, then the stone where they once sharpened tools, then the ground where they slept. And finally, it reached the point where nothing remained but sky above and ocean on every side. The people of Sunderland migrated in many directions. Some moved north across what is now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos toward the wide plains of mainland Southeast Asia. Some traveled west into India, where higher plateaus and milder climates offered stability. Some moved south, crossing the remaining high ridges to reach the islands as they were forming. But the largest group, those with the spirit of the sea, went eastward to the Philippines, to Taiwan, and farther still into the Pacific, beginning the journeys that would one day shape Polynesian culture. Perhaps it was this great migration that planted the seeds of collective memory, the memory of an ancient land vast and fertile, swallowed by the sea. And that memory, across thousands of years, grew into myth, a myth of a homeland now underwater, a place so beautiful it could not be forgotten, yet so painful no one could fully name it. When a land sinks into the ocean, it does not disappear completely. It leaves traces on the faces of the people. It leaves symbols, rituals, stories encoded into the traditions of those living along the shores of the Indian Ocean. India tells of a lost land to the south. Indonesia holds legends of villages under the water. The Philippines speaks of great plains that sank when the gods grew angry, and Polynesia remembers wide western lands where their ancestors once lived before the sea changed. The memory of Sunderland did not rise as stone walls or cities. It rose as oral tradition. It spread across Southeast Asia's coasts, flowing with migration like a quiet reminder that there was once an older world, now submerged. But it was this very disappearance, the 120-meter rise of the sea, that opened a new chapter, broader, deeper, more mysterious. For when people fled a land swallowed by the ocean, they stepped into vast seas no one had explored before, and at the edges of those horizons they began hearing stories that echoed the tale of Sunderland, but belonged to a place farther, larger, and far more enigmatic. Another land also swallowed by the sea. A land the Polynesian navigators said once lay toward the rising sun. A land we know by a different name, softer, more elusive, more mysterious, Lemuria. When the last people of Sunderland left their sinking homeland, they stepped into a world far larger than anything they had ever known, the Pacific Ocean. A vast, endless expanse where the deep blue water felt like the color of forgotten memories, where winds traveled from horizon to horizon, carrying the whispers of lands long gone. And it was in this space, the space of sea, wind, and sky, that humans created a strange treasury of legends, stories soft as mist, yet holding a very real core, the memory of a vast land that once lay toward the rising sun. The Polynesians, the great navigators of prehistory, did not merely sail across islands, they sailed across the ocean's history. They recorded memories not with stone or writing, but with the paths of stars, the shapes of winds, the way waves touched the sides of their canoes. And on their double-hulled vessels, light as birds, they travelled thousands of kilometres across open ocean, carrying with them the stories of their ancestors. Among those stories, one appears again and again, the story of a great land said to lie in the east or southeast, depending on the group. They said their ancestors did not come from the small islands they now inhabited, but from a vast plain where the sun rose over gentle mountains and set behind endless forests. In their memory, that land was so beautiful it became the place where everything began. A land of long rivers, ancient trees, and fertile valleys unrolling like silk beneath the morning light. But what makes the story haunting is not its beauty, it is its ending. The Polynesians said this land slipped beneath the sea, melted into the waves, or was swallowed by the anger of the ocean. Fragments of this memory appear in Samoa, Tonga, Hawaii, Tahiti, New Zealand. Each version is slightly different, yet all share the same motif. There was once a land so large it could not have been just an island, and that land disappeared. For the Polynesians, the ocean was not just water, it was an open book, and the memory of the lost land was like a shadow travelling with them on every voyage. When they paddled through swells 3 meters high, when the star-filled sky opened like an invisible map, they felt that behind them, beneath the deep water they could not see, something still lay quietly in place. Anthropologists once thought these tales were nothing more than myth, but as modern geology began revealing massive submerged plateaus under the Indian and Pacific Oceans, as scientists found large microcontinents that fractured and sank millions of years ago, they began to wonder, could these memories, distorted by time, be rooted in something that once truly existed? Not every legend is false. Sometimes legends are the oldest layers of memory humans possess, and strangely, the deeper we look into the underwater map of the Indian Ocean, the clearer the lost land motif becomes. When the people leaving Sunderland moved eastward, they crossed deep water regions that many millennia later, geological models would reveal were once connected to ancient continental structures. If they saw small peaks rising above the water, remnants of a submerged plateau, they might have viewed them as traces of a much larger region. And that memory, retold through generations, could easily transform into the image of a vast land that once existed toward the rising sun. And from stories like these, stories Polynesians told on their canoes in the dark sea nights with only wind and water as witnesses, a name was eventually born. Not from their culture, but from the imagination of 19th century scientists, Lemuria. Lemuria did not originate with the Polynesians, but its heart, the idea of a great land that once existed and vanished, lives in the tales they carried from generation to generation. Lemuria is simply the name given later, the haunting memory of the land that sank in the direction of sunrise is far older. When we look at these stories, we cannot be certain what is truth, what is memory, what is imagination layered over time. But we know one thing for sure: the Polynesians did not invent immense lost lands as entertainment. For them, these stories were history. They were origins. They were the gentle ghost that followed them across every voyage. Ghost made of land, not of people. And when we listen closely, we begin to feel that these stories are opening a doorway leading not only to the submerged edges of the Indian Ocean, but to a motif that echoes throughout human history. The memory of a lost land where ancestors once lived, now kept alive only in the sound of waves. In the 19th century, when European naturalists began mapping the migration patterns of plants and animals, they stumbled upon something unusual. The lemurs of Madagascar were more closely related to species in India than to those in Africa, despite the vast stretch of the Indian Ocean lying between them. This mystery could not be explained by simple evolutionary branching. And because plate tectonics and the supercontinent Gondwana were still unknown concepts, scientists of the time had only one explanation they considered reasonable: a great landmass must once have connected Madagascar to India, sinking beneath the sea. They called this hypothetical land Lemuria, named after the family Lemuridae, even though the story behind the name would grow far beyond zoology. Lemuria then was not the myth we think of today. It was a serious scientific hypothesis, built to fill the gaps in global knowledge that 19th century science had no tools to resolve. Looking at the map of the Indian Ocean, researchers imagined a broad plateau that once stretched across it before being drowned by rising seas. They believed humans, animals, and even ancient cultural traits might have spread across this lost land. Only when continental drift and plate tectonics emerged in the 20th century was the Lemuria hypothesis declared obsolete. People began seeing it as a relic of an era lacking true geological understanding. But what is more interesting is this: even though modern science rejected Lemuria in its original form, new stratigraphic evidence began opening subtler possibilities. The Indian Ocean is not a flat basin. Beneath its deep waters lies a complex world: submerged plateaus, microcontinents, torn from Madagascar and India tens of millions of years ago, underwater mountain chains curling like the spine of a massive creature, and scattered fragments of ancient crust resting on the seafloor like relics from a forgotten age. All of this forces us to look at Lemuria not as a complete vanished continent, but as a geological memory. Parts of Gondwana pulled apart, drifted, fractured. Some regions were claimed by the sea, sinking beneath the ocean's surface. Others may have risen above the waves during periods of lower sea level. And if humans ever passed through, those exposed ridges would have left powerful impressions, vivid enough to become memories passed down through generations. In a way, the breakup of ancient continental fragments beneath the Indian Ocean is the background of the Lemuria story, not as a thriving super-civilization, but as scattered lands, remnants of an ancient body, sometimes emerging in low sea eras, then disappearing again beyond human sight. If ancient travelers passed through such regions, they might have seen high ridges casting shadows across the water like great islands. If they remained for a few generations, they might have viewed these places as ancestral homelands. And when the seas rose again after the Ice Age, those islands vanished, leaving behind the memory of a land that once existed toward the rising sun, a memory echoed in Polynesian oral traditions. What is striking is this: many legends from India, Madagascar, Indonesia, and the Pacific share the same uncanny motif: a land to the east or south swallowed by the sea. These stories have nothing to do with 19th century science, yet they align with it in surprising ways. It is as though these ancient memories lived in culture for tens of thousands of years before Western scientists ever tried to name them. And here a profound question arises: are myths merely inventions, or are they the distorted layers of humanity's oldest memories? When we view Lemuria this way, Thalmid as a language of memory rather than a literal map, we begin to understand that sometimes science does not deny myth, it clarifies the shape behind it. Lemuria, as imagined in legend, may not have existed, but a forgotten geological history could very well have served as the foundation for that memory. For that reason, Lemuria stands between two worlds, part obsolete science, part ancient memory, and part story humans told each other when facing the endless ocean. Not everything ancient is found in soil. Some things live in the mind, some live in the sound of waves, and some, like the story of Lemuria, live exactly at the intersection between myth and geology, between what has been lost and what remains unexplained. And from that intersection we move deeper into the heart of the Indian Ocean, where earthquakes, fiery eruptions, and underwater mountain ranges shaped this legend long before any scientist ever gave it a name. If you place a finger on a geological map of the Earth and trace it along the rim of the Indian Ocean, you can almost feel a slow, deep pulse, the heartbeat of the planet. This is not a calm ocean as it appears on the surface. Beneath those blue waters lies a restless tectonic world, a region constantly rising and sinking, breaking apart and knitting itself back together, as if the Earth were breathing in cycles far too long for a human lifetime to witness. What we call the Indian Ocean Ring of Fire is not a neat circle like the one in the Pacific, but a chain of fractures, underwater volcanoes, submerged plateaus, and tectonic hotspots. It is a place where the Earth does not stay still, where each movement can change the shape of the ocean around it. Within this deep ocean lie names that sound like places from another world. The Mascarene Plateau, the Chagos Laccadive Ridge, the Kerguelen Plateau, the Cyclone Ridge, the Seychelles Plateau. These are not ordinary seafloors, they are ancient masses of land, some as thick as a small continent, their edges torn and reshaped by millions of years of tectonic motion. Some may have been exposed during low sea periods, some may have stood above the water, some, according to stratigraphic models, may have formed land masses large enough for humans or animals to cross. These features are the bone shadows of Gondwana, the ancient supercontinent that once connected India, Madagascar, Antarctica, Africa, and Australia into a single shape. When Gondwana split apart, not everything fractured into massive blocks like the continents we know today. Some smaller fragments, microcontinents, were left behind, drifting, sinking, and becoming trapped between the moving plates. Lemuria, as imagined in the 19th century, was a single continuous continent, but Lemuria, seen through the lens of modern science, looks more like a symphony of real fragments, vast plateaus hidden underwater, ancient crust partially submerged, underwater mountain chains curved into shapes that, if pieced together, hint at a land that may once have stretched somewhere between Madagascar and India. These geological clues do not prove Lemuria as myth described it, but they also make the idea far from unreasonable. Consider the Mascarene Plateau, a wide, flat region between India and Madagascar. According to several models, parts of it were exposed during lower sea levels. Animals found in both Madagascar and India may have crossed here. And if prehistoric humans followed those herds, they may have lived for generations on large islands that have now vanished completely. Consider the Seychelles microcontinent, a massive granite block separated from India tens of millions of years ago. This is not young ocean floor, it is true continental crust, which means there was once real land where only deep ocean exists today. Or the Kerguelen Plateau, one of the largest submerged landforms on the planet, the size of Western Europe. It lies mostly underwater now, but studies show it once rose as a vast island chain millions of years ago. A world that existed, then was consumed by the sea. And there are many more fragments, each like a note in the earth's long chord, a music humans could not hear with their ears, but could sense through memory, stories, and oral tradition passed through centuries of ocean nights. That is why when Polynesian navigators speak of a vast land toward the rising sun, when Tamil traditions describe a land stretching southward, when Madagascar holds stories of regions swallowed by the sea, we cannot dismiss them all as coincidence. Beneath those waters there truly are ancient pieces of land, not myth, but geological fact. Perhaps they never formed a single, unified continent. Perhaps they were never large enough to support the kind of civilization Plato described, but they were large enough to leave memories. Memories of places that may have existed during low-sea eras, and when those places sank, the memory became an echo carried into the cultures of many peoples. For prehistoric humans, the important thing was not the movement of tectonic plates. It was the realization that land itself could disappear. And when it did, the memory did not die. It slipped into myth, into stories told beside firelight, into the mental maps of places that no longer exist. Lemuria, then, is not simply a product of an age lacking scientific understanding. It is the shape humanity gave to a deeper truth. The earth is not fixed, and lands that once existed can vanish without leaving a trace upon the sea's surface. And from that geological foundation we begin to sense the movement of people, those who may have lived on the fragments now submerged beneath the ocean. They carried language, culture, memory. They created cultural motifs stretching from Madagascar to India, from Indonesia to the Pacific Islands. When we look at the stratigraphic map of the Indian Ocean, where submerged plateaus and microcontinents lie scattered like fragments of memory blurred by waves, we cannot help but wonder whether during the Ice Age, when sea levels were more than 100 meters lower, those lands once rose above the water and welcomed human footsteps. If that ever happened, where did those ancient people go when the sea rose? What did they carry with them? And what traces of them remain today? Not in stone, but in us, in our blood, in our languages, and in the stories whispered across cultures? The strangest truth appears when we place the genetic maps of Madagascar, South India, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Indonesia, and East Africa side by side. They are not separated the way geography suggests. Instead, they overlap like veins crossing beneath the skin, as if there had once been an invisible transfer station between them all, a land not quite African, not quite Indian, not quite Southeast Asian, but situated exactly where Lemuria was once imagined, where ancient terraces may have risen during low sea periods before sinking again beneath thousands of meters of water. The most compelling evidence comes from DNA, a form of memory that never lies. When geneticists studied the Malagasy people of Madagascar, they found that a large portion of their DNA came from ancient Indonesians, especially from South Borneo and South Sulawesi. This means Austronesian ancestors crossed more than 6,000 kilometers of open ocean to reach Madagascar, proving that long before modern records, trans-Indian ocean migration routes likely existed, especially during eras when exposed plateaus and islands served as natural stepping stones. Beyond DNA, language speaks as well. The Dravidian languages, Tamil, Malayalam, Kannada, among the oldest families in South Asia, contain phonetic and structural echoes of Austronesian island languages, not identical but resonant, like the faint imprint of a time when two communities lived close together for centuries. One hypothesis suggests that the ancestors of the Dravidian languages may have lived on a vast land south of India, a land no longer above water, a land Tamil memory calls Kumari Nadu and 19th century imagination called Lemuria. When we reach Madagascar, culture tells the same story in a different voice. Musical instruments, rhythms, roof designs, even the outrigger canoe of the Malagasy mirror those of Indonesia and Polynesia, not Africa. Their ancient legends describe an eastern homeland, a place their ancestors lived before crossing the ocean to their new island. Meanwhile, Tamil literature from the Sangam era speaks of Kumari Nadu, a land swallowed by the sea, once home to kingdoms and ancient cities. Two stories, thousands of kilometers apart, but sharing a single motif, a lost land, a memory that did not drown with it. When we piece together Madagascar, Tamil Nadu, Indonesia, and Polynesia, a thin but unmistakable red thread emerges, a shared memory of land that vanished beneath the Indian Ocean. What strengthens the idea that ancient people once lived on now submerged land is not the claim of a complete continent, but the geological logic. When sea levels were 120 meters lower, the Mascarene Plateau, the Seychelles Bank, and the Laccadive Chagos Ridge could have risen as great island chains, large enough to host temporary settlements, trade routes, or way stations for seafaring groups. These archipelagos may have lasted for thousands of years, long enough to create deep exchanges between South Asians, East Africans, and Southeast Asians, long enough to leave genetic signatures, linguistic blends, and cultural motifs that we still see today. When the ice melted and the seas rose, those lands disappeared. But the people continued onward, carrying their homeland in memory, and over hundreds of generations that memory changed shape, shifting from geography into myth, from reality into symbol. Because when land disappears, only its people carry it forward. A person who watches the sea swallow their home will never forget. A community forced to abandon the last ground of their ancestors will never forget. And such memories, no matter how many times the waves rise, find ways to live on in stories, in legends, in DNA, in language, in the persistent idea of a land taken by the sea. From here, our journey begins to slip even deeper, into an ancient world beneath the Indian Ocean, a world with no visible ruins on land, yet perhaps still echoing through the stratigraphy of the seafloor and the stubborn memories of those who once passed through that age. If one day you stood in the middle of the Indian Ocean while the water lay still as slow breath, you would see a surface so flat it looked like a vast mirror hiding a secret the earth has deliberately allowed to sleep. Beneath that calm lies a world that once moved with force, a world of continental fragments stretched and torn, of submerged plateaus drifting away from the land, of regions that once rose during low sea eras, only to disappear forever as the ocean returned to claim them. Look down, and you will not find cities or monuments, but their absence does not mean nothing ever existed. Sometimes the earth does not preserve what it takes. Sometimes it leaves only shapes. Drowned mountain ranges, slabs of ancient granite, corals growing atop what was once a continent, now known by a simple name, the sea floor. The fragments of Gondwana beneath the Indian Ocean are like shadows, not enough to tell the whole story, but clear enough to show that a far larger world once existed there. Perhaps they never formed a complete continent. Perhaps they were never large enough to create a civilization as later generations imagined. But their existence, enduring millions of years, then vanishing, was enough to nourish distant memories in many cultures. Madagascar, remembering a land to the east, Tamil traditions recalling Kumari Kandam, drowned beneath the sea, Polynesian navigators speaking of plains where the sun first rises. By the 19th century, Western science gathered all these echoes under one name, Lemuria. But perhaps the truest way to understand Lemuria is not as a lost continent, but as a gap in human understanding, a gap filled by memory, legend, and imagination shaped around things that once were real. Because a land does not need to endure forever, it only needs to exist long enough for humans to see it. When it disappears, its memory clings to them for thousands of years, like the last light lingering after a star has died. Listen closely, and both the Pacific and the Indian Oceans whisper the same refrain. There were lands that existed, and then they were gone. Doggerland once bridged Europe, Sunderland was once a fertile superplain, Beringia once connected continents, and Lemuria, though never a complete continent, remains the shadow of fragments drowned across millions of years of geological upheaval. None of these worlds tell their stories fully, yet all remind us that today's map is only a fleeting moment in Earth's endless geological time. Imagine an ancient person standing on a small island, looking out toward the water where their ancestors once lived, where a plain had been swept away. How could they not retell that? And as the story passed through thousands of years of speech and memory, it ceased to be mere recollection. It became myth, a way of preserving what the sea had taken. Lemuria, in that sense, is not the answer to a geological equation. It is the quiet space between what is known and what has slipped beyond memory. And yet, when we look closely at the modern ocean map, we find a truth more astonishing than myth. Not every sunken continent is imaginary. Beneath the South Pacific lies a landmass submerged by 94%, larger than Lemuria ever was in legend, unmistakable, and recognized by science with full geological legitimacy. A true continent with its own plate boundary, tectonic structure, and millions of years of history, not myth, not metaphor, not symbol. It is Zealandia, a real continent that sank. And to understand Zealandia, we must step into a space where the boundary between mystery and science begins to blur. Because if a real continent like Zealandia can vanish beneath the sea and remain unnoticed until the 21st century, then the greatest question behind every story of lost lands suddenly becomes clearer than ever. If Zealandia could disappear, how many other lands vanished before humanity ever knew they existed? If the stories of Lemuria make us wonder whether an entire continent could truly sink beneath the sea, then Zealandia appears like a quiet but precise reply. Yes. And not only is it possible, it already happened, slowly, silently, at a depth far beyond what the human imagination is used to grasp. On a modern map, New Zealand looks like two lonely islands drifting near the eastern edge of the Pacific Ocean. But once you descend beneath that deep blue water, you realize they are only the visible peaks of a world nearly two-thirds the size of Australia. A real continent with thick crust, defined boundaries, and its own tectonic structure, except almost all of it now lies underwater. And the name Zealandia, which sounds immense, was only officially recognized a few years ago. The story of Zealandia begins tens of millions of years in the past, when the supercontinent Gondwana broke apart. In that long process, pieces of land once connected to Australia, Antarctica, Madagascar, and Southeast Asia were stretched, fractured, and carried away. One of those pieces, Zealandia, was thinner than the others, lighter, and far more vulnerable to settling as the oceans widened. That invisible pulling force slowly lowered the entire continent, and as sea levels rose during later climate cycles, 94% of Zealandia disappeared beneath the water, leaving New Zealand, New Caledonia, and a few scattered islands as the last mountain tops refusing to surrender. What makes Zealandia extraordinary is not only that it sank, but how well it hid. For centuries, seafloor maps showed only vague bumps beneath the waves, and science at the time lacked the precision to recognize them as continental crust. Only when geologists measured crust thickness, analyzed minerals, and traced the structure of the underlying rock did they realize those underwater hills were not volcanic features. They were pieces of true continent submerged by the ocean. And when those findings were published, the scientific world had to face something unbelievable. Humanity had just identified a new continent, not in legend but on an actual map. Yet Zealandia is remarkable for another reason: its silence. A silence that makes us forget it once carried forests, warm climates, rivers, valleys, and possibly the footsteps of early humans. Sediments extracted from its seafloor reveal that it was once a vibrant, living world, a place with a geological lifespan far older than all written human history combined. If a landmass nearly 5 million square kilometers wide can vanish like that, quietly, without a trace, then how many other worlds slipped beneath prehistoric seas long before we had names for them. This is what makes Zealandia singular. It is not just geological evidence, but a reminder that today's map is only a temporary layer on Earth's endlessly shifting face. Today, as scientists lower drill cores into the Pacific seabed, they are reopening the first pages of a book Zealandia closed tens of millions of years ago. Every sample lifted from the depths is a letter, a sentence, a memory of that continent. Fossilized layers speak of forests, of living creatures, of times when the land still breathed above water. And as those fragments are laid under laboratory light, a gentle truth emerges. Sometimes the world does not vanish, it simply sinks beyond our sight. Zealandia, then, is not just a scientific discovery. It is a door into the realization that Earth is far larger than what we assume we have already understood. The planet's memory is longer than human memory, and while the ocean can hide a continent, it cannot hide the story forever. From Zealandia, our journey moves deeper into the ocean, where submerged mountain ranges, ancient fault lines, and ever-thickening layers of sediment continue the tale of this world. A solitary continent, forgotten beneath the sea, but never truly erased from the story of Earth. When we look at New Zealand on a map, it appears as a world unto itself. Snow-covered mountains beside deep valleys, narrow plains pressed against the coastline, landscapes that seem to breathe on their own rhythm. But everything we see is only the exposed edge, a small, visible portion of a much larger continent lying beneath the water. That hidden portion carries a story so long that the entire span of human time is nothing more than a thin breath gliding across its surface. That story begins roughly 80 million years ago when the supercontinent Gondwana fractured. It was not an explosive shattering, but a slow, patient movement, as though the Earth were gently easing apart its enormous fingers. In that movement, a thin, light, stretched piece of crust began drifting away from Australia and Antarctica. That piece, fragile, elongated and solitary, became Zealandia. Unlike traditional continents with thick, stable crust, Zealandia was weaker, like a sheet of skin pulled taut across a widening ocean. As tectonic plates shifted, as the seafloor rose and sank, the entire landmass gradually subsided, not in a single dramatic fall, but through a quiet descent lasting tens of millions of years. Eventually, only the highest points remained above water: New Zealand, New Caledonia, and a few scattered islands, the lonely beacons of a world that was once far larger. If we could have seen Zealandia before it sank, we might have been stunned by a landscape unlike anything left on Earth today. Long plateaus, valleys carved like ancient scars, forests stretching to the horizon, rivers flowing across the continent like the vascular system of a great living body. Zealandia was not a geological accident. It was the product of countless subtle motions in the continental crust. Where magma rose, where the Earth's shell stretched, where the ocean quietly waited to reclaim its weakest ground. And when Zealandia finally sank, it did not vanish like the legends of Atlantis, not in a single night, not in a fury of waves, not in a grand collapse. It disappeared in another way, slowly, evenly, relentlessly, like a long exhale from the planet. The subsidence never erased every sign. It merely turned the continent into a secret resting beneath the deep blue water. That is why when scientists drilled into the seafloor, they found fragments of memory still waiting: pollen from ancient forests, petrified wood, river sand, bits of bark, even traces of plants that once met the wind above ground. These remnants remained silent for tens of millions of years, as though waiting for humanity to mature enough to understand that a continent can vanish without leaving a wound on the ocean's surface. Then a strange thought emerges. If a real continent spanning more than 4.9 million square kilometers can sink by 94% and remain unknown to humanity for millions of years, are the memories of Sundaland, Beringia, or Lemuria truly as distant as we imagine? Zealandia becomes a mirror showing us that what lies beneath the water today is not always the sea. Sometimes it is the legacy of worlds that once existed. The earth has never been fixed. Coastlines are only temporary boundaries. What we now call ocean may once have been land, and what we dismiss as myth may be nothing more than geological memory compressed across unimaginable time. Through its quiet existence, Zealandia reminds us that this planet is always changing, and that stories of sunken continents are not always inventions of the human mind. And so Zealandia is not merely a geological problem. It is a reminder that beneath the surface of our world lie stories not yet fully told, chapters erased from maps but never erased from the planet's memory. Once we understand the long drift and descent of Zealandia, we begin to see why other lands, whether grounded in science or in legend, continue returning to the human imagination as incomplete pieces of Earth's ancient history. If you were standing on a headland where New Zealand meets the ocean, looking down at the deep blue waves rolling toward shore, it would be hard to imagine that only a few hundred meters beneath that water lie the remnants of a world that was once alive. A world where forests cast long shadows, where rivers cut through wide valleys, where winds swept across grasslands, just as it does on any continent today. And yet that is the truth. Zealandia once stood above the surface, not as a pair of small islands, but as a landmass spanning millions of square kilometers, large enough to host its own climate, its own ecosystems, and perhaps forms of life we have never known. We can glimpse what Zealandia looked like by looking at New Zealand today. Two high ridges left behind from a sunken continent. The ancient forests here are not just beautiful, they are living relics of the ecosystems that once covered the greater Zealandia. Giant moa once walked through its old valleys, while the small, wingless kiwi seems like the last soft echo of creatures that never needed to fly in a world without predators. Trees like kauri, rimu and miro, living for thousands of years, stand like ancient pillars of the primeval forest that once stretched across this continent. But that is only what survived. Most of Zealandia's life, buried forests, extinct animals, vanished ecosystems, now lies inside deep layers of sediment beneath the seafloor. When scientists drill into the Pacific bed, they find pollen from long-lost trees, petrified wood from ancient conifer forests, even fragments of bone from animals that once roamed the land. These remnants are like torn pages from a book washed away by the sea. Incomplete, but more than enough to prove the book once existed. Zealandia did not sink in a sudden, legendary catastrophe. It sank slowly, quietly, following the movement of tectonic plates, which means life on it had to adapt over many millennia. Animals migrated from high ground to low, from forest to mountain, from inland regions to coastal strips as the sea advanced. Some species disappeared, some transformed, some moved to land that remained above water. And this long selection shaped the strange and beautiful wildlife of modern New Zealand, at once familiar and completely separate from the rest of the world. The question often asked is, did humans ever walk on Zealandia? Science has no clear answer. Zealandia began to sink tens of millions of years ago, far earlier than modern humans appeared, but its higher regions may have risen as large islands during periods of low sea levels, such as 120,000, 80,000, or even 20,000 years ago. During those times, Homo sapiens already existed, already migrated, already mastered seafaring and hunting. There is nothing impossible about ancient humans, perhaps coming from northern Australia, setting foot on exposed lands that left no lasting archaeological trace. Communities living with organic materials such as wood, bamboo, and softstone may have existed without leaving durable evidence, and so this absence is not a denial. It is simply silence. Silence from a land that has not yet told its full story. But Zealandia's story is not limited to whether humans reached it. It is the story of a world that once thrived, then slowly vanished as the Earth's cycles shifted. A world now reduced to a few mountain peaks rising above the ocean in the form of New Zealand, New Caledonia, and scattered reefs. Zealandia feels like a divided spirit, one part still alive with wind and birdsong, another part resting quietly in deep water. And when we walk through New Zealand's ancient forests, listening to leaves brushing in the wind, it is hard not to feel that we are standing on the last surviving fragments of a continent that has faded from the face of the earth. Every tree, every bird, every layer of soil seems to hold the echo of a much larger world that no longer exists. Looking back, Zealandia is not a lost continent. It is a left-behind one, an ancient traveller drifting away from Gondwana, carrying with it forests, mountains, rivers, animals, and perhaps even the footprints of early humans. It did not disappear, it simply became so quiet that we forgot it existed. But when the rocks speak, when sediments retell the story, Zealandia reappears as a reminder that what we believe is gone may only be elsewhere, waiting to be seen. And from the story of this sunken continent, we move into the next chapter, where modern technology begins to redraw the shape of Zealandia and lets us see for the first time the living world that once existed beneath the deep waters of the Pacific Ocean. When 21st century scientists looked down into the Pacific Basin and realized that Zealandia was not just a rugged stretch of seafloor, but a real continent, the world map suddenly felt larger. Not because the Earth had grown, but because our knowledge had opened another door, a submerged layer that had never truly been lost. For millions of years, Zealandia seemed to choose silence beneath the water, but each survey project of recent decades has acted like a stitch, sewing back the outline of a world the ocean once tried to erase. Survey ships drift slowly across the waves, carrying sonar, water-penetrating radar, and instruments precise enough to reconstruct the seafloor down to the millimeter. Every sweep of sonar is like a brushstroke sketching the shape of Zealandia, and from millions of data points, a three-dimensional portrait of the sunken continent rises, mountain ranges that once stood in open air, deep basins, broad plateaus stretching hundreds of kilometers, all gradually returning as though emerging from shadow. During geological drilling, scientists pull up core samples as tall as a human body. Layer by layer, they uncover ancient pollen, river sand instead of marine sand, organic fragments that once felt sunlight. These are not merely materials, they are whispers from a continent that once lived, once grew green, once felt wind and sun, before slipping quietly beneath rising seas and shifting crust. specimens that lay silent for tens of millions of years, when placed under laboratory lights, carry a stillness that makes us feel remarkably small. In the moment the rock begins to speak, it feels as if a forgotten world is calling its own name, as if it never fully accepted disappearing from the planet's story. Zealandia reveals a strange, vast gap between what our eyes can see and what truly exists. The ocean does not merely cover, it dissolves boundaries, blurs Earth's memory beneath a layer of water thicker than any wall. And beneath that concealment, Zealandia is not an exception. It is proof that this planet still holds chapters untold, lands not yet understood. If a continent nearly 5 million square kilometers wide can lie beneath our feet and still be overlooked, how many other secrets remain unseen? But our journey does not end with Zealandia, because every time a forgotten world is found, our attention shifts to the next, to places that did not sink completely, but disappeared from maps in their own way. One of those places is Beringia, the superplane that once connected Asia and North America during the Ice Age. A land that was not only a geographical bridge, but a bridge of culture, ecology, and the deep history of human migration. Today, Beringia rests beneath the cold Bering Sea, but in the past it was wider than the state of Texas, stretching with endless grasslands, massive herds of animals, and the first human communities crossing into a new world in what became the greatest migration in our species' history. The sea covered it, the ice retreated, but its memory remains in the stories of the Inuit, Yupik, and Athabascan peoples, echoes of a world our eyes can no longer see. And so, as Zealandia emerges under the glow of sonar, it reminds us that the map is never finished, just as Beringia reminds us that humanity's earliest bridges were not built of stone, but of earth, earth later reclaimed by the sea. Discovering Zealandia is not only a scientific achievement, it is a doorway into the planet's long memory. The memory of worlds that once existed, once were forgotten, and are now waiting to be seen again. As you leave the deep blues of the Pacific behind and travel north, the world shifts into an entirely different palette: the silver of ice, the brown of exposed earth, the white of snow. But beneath the cold water of today's Bering Sea lies a landmass that was once larger than Texas, a vast natural bridge stretching between Asia and North America. Beringia, a world that was neither fully continent nor fully ocean, has disappeared from modern maps, yet its memory lingers in the northern wind and in the stories of the peoples who live between ice and sky. 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, when the Ice Age reached its peak, Beringia did not lie underwater, but rose as a superplane spanning millions of square kilometers. There were no forests, no deserts, none of the fertile valleys familiar farther south. Instead, Beringia was a kingdom of grass, a strange ecosystem scientists call the mammoth steppe, a mix of hardy grasses, wildflowers, lichens, and low shrubs built for cold. This was the homeland of the great Ice Age animals: woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, Arctic antelope, wild horses, giant bison, cave lions, and endless migrating herds. Imagine a plain so large your eyes could never reach its edge, winds sweeping endlessly across pale gold grass, mammoth herds leaving deep grooves in the frozen ground. Beringia was not the desolate wasteland we often picture when we think of the Ice Age. It was a living world, cold but not dead, harsh but full of breath. And strangely, much of Beringia remained ice-free, even as glaciers spread across both Asia and North America. It became a kind of Arctic oasis, a place where life could endure without being swallowed by ice. This rare opening made Beringia a colossal migration corridor. Homo sapiens groups from Siberia 30,000 years ago, people who hunted mammoths, crafted thin blades and burned animal fat for light, likely found in Beringia a temporary homeland. Many scholars believe that the ancestors of most indigenous peoples of the Americas lived here for thousands of years before moving deeper into the New World. For them, Beringia was not simply something to cross, it was a place to live, where they raised children, hunted mammoths, built shelters from bone, and kept fires burning through long, moonless nights. The first people to enter the Americas were not hurried travelers on a narrow land bridge. They were residents of Beringia, people who knew its winds and the rhythms of its herds. Today, as the Bering Sea stretches over what was once a super plain, it is difficult to believe land once reached so far. But evidence remains in the DNA of the Inuit, the Yupik, the Athabascan, in northern legends about the great grasslands that sank, and in stone tools found in both Siberia and Alaska, tools crafted in the same ancient style, testimony to a people who once shared a common home. Like Doggerland and Sunderland, Beringia is a vast chapter in the human story, a chapter the ocean has closed, but memory still keeps alive. Beringia was the doorway into the Americas, the beginning of the journeys that would one day shape Inca, Maya, Inuit, and countless other cultures. It was the meeting point of two halves of the world. In every step our ancestors took, this kingdom of grass left a deeper mark than any map could capture. But like all lands of the Ice Age, Beringia could not escape Earth's final rule. As the climate warmed, the ice melted, and the sea crept into every grassland valley, every ancient river. Plains became shallow seas, then deep ocean. In just a few thousand years, of the briefest breath in geological time, the entire kingdom of grass sank beneath the waves. Beringia disappeared, but like all vanished lands, it never fully left the world. It remains in DNA, in stories, in the rituals of northern peoples. And from this land that once connected two continents came the mixing, adapting, and first steps of human beings on American soil. At the northern edge of Beringia, right where the Ice Age descended like a towering white wall, that existed a world suspended between life and absolute cold. This borderland followed no fixed rule except the breath of climate and the slow rhythm of geological time. Yet it was here, in the heart of that brutal cold, that humans and great herds of Ice Age animals wove one of the most enduring chapters of the planet's story. In our imagination, the Ice Age is often pictured as a frozen wasteland, a world locked in ice. But Beringia, especially along its northern rim, was the great exception. While Eurasia and North America lay buried under glaciers kilometers thick, the land between Siberia and Alaska remained open, dry, bright, and astonishingly alive. Mammoths and other great beasts came to this place as though it were a natural winter refuge, a cold paradise where snow covered the ground but never smothered the resilient grasslands, where tough, energy-rich grasses grew thick, where the dry climate allowed herds to migrate endlessly. People arrived in Beringia not as conquerors, but as listeners. They followed the herds, built shelters where the wind offered cover, and fueled their fires with animal fat through nights that stretched without end. They read the direction of the wind, studied the way snow whipped across the ground to predict storms, and set traps along the paths antelope favored. These early groups, ancestors of many indigenous peoples of the Americas, lived with rhythm and order, settling into Beringia's cycles as naturally as if they were another element of the land. On a morning in that ancient world, frost covered the ground, mammoth breath drifted like pale mist, and hunters stood silent just meters from a grazing herd. The hunt was more than survival. It was almost a ritual. Mammoths were meat, hide, bone, fat, shelter, warmth, the foundation of all life in the cold. Their bones formed the frames of homes, their hides insulated like natural walls, their fat burned bright in the dark, their meat sustained entire groups through winter. To understand the mammoth was to understand the secret of living at the edge of ice. Remarkably, Beringia was not merely a passage between continents. It became home long enough to form a distinct population. Genetic studies call this period the Beringian standstill, a time when the ancestors of indigenous Americans were isolated between massive ice sheets and lived in Beringia for thousands of years. That span was long enough for biological adaptations to take shape. Smaller, more heat-efficient bodies, enhanced fat metabolism, diets built around meat to match the Arctic world. These were not the changes of a few generations, but of a people shaped by life on Earth's frozen rim. Then the world began to melt, the ice retreated, the sea rose and flooded the golden grasslands. Mammoth valleys became cold bays. Large animals lost their habitat. Many vanished, others fled. And humans, as always in history, continued moving. This time they moved south into the vast new continent opening behind the melting walls of ice. Before Beringia sank, it was a complete world. Sweeping grasslands, roaming herds, mammoth bone dwellings, fires fueled by fat, long silent nights, and resilient people who learned to read even the smallest signals of nature. When that world disappeared, the sea did not simply claim a landmass. It erased an entire rhythm of life, a rhythm science now reconstructs only through bones, DNA, and ancient mammoth tracks frozen in permafrost. Like Doggerland, Sunderland, and Zealandia, Beringia vanished, but not from human memory. It remains in the genes of the Inuit, the Yup'ik, the Athabascan, in northern songs about lost grasslands, and in the whisper of the Arctic wind, reminding us that a world once lived between the continents. When a world disappears, it rarely goes in the roar of a single disaster. More often, it withdraws from the surface of the earth through quiet, patient movements, so slow that humans do not realize what is happening until everything has slipped too far to reach. Beringia was no different. It did not shatter in one violent moment. It did not drown in a single night. Instead, it unraveled gradually, following the long, steady breath of a warming climate. After about 20,000 years ago, the ice began melting faster, not in seasonal rhythms, but in the cadence of millennia. Along the ice-covered mountains of southern Alaska, enormous glaciers cracked apart. Rivers of ice, hundreds of kilometers long, retreated, revealing soils buried since earlier ages. Each collapse sent billions of liters of fresh water rushing into the ocean. And the ocean, patient as always, began to advance across the great plains of Beringia with slow, deliberate steps. At first, only small inlets appeared in the lowest valleys. Then spring after spring grew too warm, turning dry ground into wetlands. Rivers changed course. Stretches of firm land softened into shallow lakes. Valley after valley of grass was claimed by the sea, not with violent waves, but with the cold, steady touch of water creeping inland. The mammoths sensed this shift long before humans did. They smelled salt water drifting into the grasslands, felt the ground soften beneath their weight, noticed their old migration paths thinning as vegetation changed. Summers carried more storms, the air grew damp and briny, many plants lost their footing, and humans, sensitive to every nuance of their surroundings, understood all of it immediately. They knew the ice was melting fast. They saw herds change direction. They watched lowlands transform into wide pools over just a handful of winters. And as they had done in so many worlds before, they moved again. First, along the eastern edge of Alaska, where the ice was retreating and new land opened. Then farther inland, down the Yukon, the Tanana, and into regions where the climate had softened. Across thousands of years, more footsteps left Beringia than returned, and the land that had once been a temporary homeland slowly became memory. But the drowning of Beringia did not stop there. This time, the pace quickened. During the event known as Meltwater Pulse 1A around 14,600 years ago, global sea levels rose at a nearly unbelievable rate. Century by century, the ocean pushed forward tens, then hundreds of meters. Grassland valleys became bays. The places where mammoths once watched the sunrise became seafloor. Low hills where humans once built shelters from mammoth bone now survive only as submerged ridges in cold, dark water. No miracle could hold back the ocean when the entire climate system was shifting. No structure, no ritual could persuade the sea to return what it had claimed. Beringia sank the same way every land before it has, quietly and without reversal. When the final valleys flooded, when the wind no longer swept across golden grass, and when mammoth tracks survived only in frozen mud at the bottom of the sea, the earth closed a chapter. But that chapter was never lost. It lives on in the DNA of Alaska Natives, Inuit and Athabascan peoples, in the ecology of permafrost, in stones resting tens of meters below the waves, in stories passed down about the land that once connected two worlds. And Beringia repeats what Doggerland, Sunderland and Zealandia have each whispered in their own way. Every land has a lifespan. Not because it is cursed, not because humans caused it, but because this planet is always moving. There is a strange beauty in that motion. The beauty of worlds passing by, like footprints in sand, just clear enough to show someone once stood there before the waves arrived. When Beringia vanished completely around 11,000 years ago, the last people who saw it stepped into the Americas, carrying with them the memory of a cold grassland plain, a world that no longer exists in reality, yet lives on in legend and in the blood of their descendants. When a land disappears from the face of the earth, we often imagine that every trace of it vanishes too. But Beringia did not dissolve into nothing. It lived on, not through soil or grass, but through memory, a thing the ocean cannot wash away. There was no writing to preserve what happened there, but human voices were strong enough to carry those memories across thousands of years, weaving them into the myths, stories, and rituals of the peoples who lived along the shores of the world that once existed. The northern communities, Inuit, Yupik, Chukchi, Athabascan, never called that land Beringia, but they held stories of a vast plain where sea and earth were not yet divided, where ancestors walked as though a doorway had opened and then quietly closed. These stories were never shaped like maps. They were shaped like memory, soft-edged, shifting, yet more enduring than any line drawn on paper. In the cold wind of the Arctic, Inuit elders tell of a great plain swallowed when the sea rose in anger. They say the shoreline once lay far beyond today's horizon, that the places they now paddle their kayaks were once dry ground, where mammoth hunts unfolded across endless grass. Some stories describe the summer sun setting very slowly, a delicate detail that matches the long, lingering days of high latitudes, the days their ancestors once walked on land rather than sea. The Chukchi of Siberia carry similar memories in their tales of the paths of the ancestors, long corridors of grass and ice where groups of people followed herds of giant animals. Some stories say the land was eaten away by water, that the plain became sea when the sun grew hotter. To modern ears it sounds metaphorical. To the language of geology it sounds like memory of the great warming at the end of the Ice Age. Athabascan peoples, living far inland in North America, remember that they came from the northwest, from a place where the land touched the grey sky. A simple image, yet eerily accurate to what it feels like to stand in Beringia during winter, where ice stretched so far it met the horizon. They say their ancestors walked into the New World on foot, with no ocean to block them, a quiet testimony that the continents were once connected. Viewed through an archaeological lens, these tales sound like fragments of natural history still echoing. But they also remind us that human memory can last much longer than we assume. Without maps, without writing, memory still travels, by voice, by breath, by the gaze of elders looking out over the sea. What is strange, though, is how this pattern repeats everywhere. Across ancient cultures, from the Arctic to the Pacific, from Asia to Europe, people describe lands that sank, places ancestors once lived, departed, and watched the ocean reclaim. The Inuit remember Beringia, Southeast Asians remember Sunderland, Europeans recall Doggerland, the Polynesians remember Hawaii, and the Tamil people of southern India remember Kumari Kandam, a land seen not only as geography, but as the birthplace of culture and language. Along the fishing villages of Tamil Nadu, elders speak of Pandya Nadu, a vast land that once stretched far to the south before the ocean consumed it. In the ancient Sangam poems there are verses about 3 cities taken by the sea, about waters that rose without end, about a loss not of a town, but of an entire world. Science has not confirmed the existence of such a continent, yet the memory remains, strong as stone, persistent as the flow of the Tamil language itself. The similarity of all these stories reveals something profound. The memory of lost lands is not the heritage of one people. It is a shared experience of humanity. As the sea rose after the Ice Age, countless regions were drowned, and humans, whether in the Arctic, in India, in Europe, or Southeast Asia, carried that memory forward in their own way. Geology records the past in layers of sediment. Humans record it in stories. Among all the stories of vanished lands, Kumari Kandam belongs to a different kind of myth entirely. It is not merely whispered beside a fire, nor is it just a legend recited during festivals. For the Tamil people, Kumari Kandam is an origin, a homeland their ancestors believed once nourished the earliest generations, before the ocean rose and carried away every city, every academy, every trace of an ancient civilization. To them, Kumari Kandam is not just a myth, it is identity. If you stand on the shores of Kanyakumari, where the tip of South India touches the Indian Ocean, you may feel something hard to name. The horizon there does not simply divide sky and sea. It feels like a boundary between the present and a world that has slipped beneath the water. The waves do not just crash on rock, they speak with a deep, ancient tone, as though they carry a language older than any script ever created. Tamil tradition tells that before the ocean swept in, the Indian peninsula stretched far to the south, toward Madagascar, perhaps even toward regions now part of Indonesia. That vanished land was called Kumari Kandam, a place of radiant cities, of Pandian kings, of the first Sangam academies, where the earliest Tamil poetry may have been born. In the oldest Sangam verses, there are passages describing land swallowed by the sea 3 times, of kings forced to move their capitals because the waters kept rising. The poems do not speak the language of geology, yet they describe its events with unsettling precision: rising seas, sinking coasts, families leaving the homeland they could no longer hold. Many people compare Kumari Kandam to Atlantis, but the 2 myths were born from different minds. Atlantis appears only in 2 short philosophical passages by Plato: abstract, symbolic, distant. Kumari Kandam stretches across thousands of lines of poetry, across legends, epics, and the roots of the Tamil language itself. If Atlantis is an open question, Kumari Kandam is an unhealed memory. Tamil people do not say, "Perhaps we came from there." They say, "We originate from Kumari Kandam," a declaration carrying cultural weight rather than archaeological proof. Still the question lingers: was Kumari Kandam ever a real land? Modern science says no continent sank south of India within the last tens of thousands of years. Geology confirms that India was once linked to Antarctica and Madagascar during Gondwana. But that was hundreds of millions of years ago, far too early for humans to exist. For many, this means Kumari Kandam must be symbolic, not literal. Yet myth and science are not enemies. Sometimes they describe the same truth in different languages. Perhaps Kumari Kandam was not a continent millions of square kilometers wide, but it may well be a cultural memory of coastal lands drowned at the end of the Ice Age. Like Doggerland, like Sunderland, like the ancient shelves around India that were exposed when sea levels were lower by hundreds of feet. When the ocean rose roughly 120 meters worldwide, vast regions along South India disappeared forever. Valleys, ancient rivers, villages, harbors, all swallowed by the sea. Real losses large enough to anchor themselves in collective memory. What makes Kumari Kandam remarkable is not whether it existed as a continent, but how the Tamil people preserved its memory, not through maps but through literature, not through stone but through language, a language they see as sacred, a thread connecting them to their earliest ancestors. In Sangam poetry, every word feels like an attempt to hold on to the shadow of a lost world. Salt-soaked cities, winds that tore the coastline apart, families carrying music, philosophy, and knowledge to new lands after the old ones were claimed by the sea. Even if science never uncovers a sunken supercontinent, one truth remains: a culture spanning thousands of years still remembers a land that vanished. Collective memory does not appear from nowhere. It always grows from something real, even if time has blurred the shape of that truth. And when we realize that countless cultures around the world remember lands drowned by the sea, we begin to see a familiar pattern. Humanity remembers rising oceans not first through numbers, but through stories. In that sense, Kumari Kandam is not merely a place, it is a longing carried across generations, the echo of a time when the sea rose and swept away entire worlds people once called home. And from that myth, our journey turns toward a deeper question, one about the origins of language and the spread of humanity. Could memories like Kumari Kandam be clues to how early people named the world in the dawn of history? Among the many ideas that have grown out of the memory of Kumari Kandam, there is one hypothesis more debated and more beautiful than all the rest: the belief that human language itself may have begun on a land now drowned beneath the Indian Ocean. For the Tamil people, this is not a scientific ambition nor a claim to cultural dominance. It feels more like a distant echo, a soft whisper from a tradition that believes the Tamil spoken today is the last resonance of a time when ancient people first named the world. To understand this idea, we have to step into the world of the Tamil language, one of the oldest living tongues, whose Sangam literary tradition stretches back more than 2,000 years. But literature is only the surface. The deeper roots of the Dravidian language family may reach into an era before metal, perhaps even before agriculture spread across southern India. Dravidian stands alone, steady, quiet, enduring, like an ancient rock in the swirling river of surrounding language families. Many scholars believe the Dravidian languages descend from pre-Aryan communities who lived in southern India tens of thousands of years ago. If so, these people may have witnessed the first great pulses of rising seas, the slow drowning of coastal plains, and the forced migrations inland or northward. In that context, the idea that language began in the south is not an arrogant claim, but a cultural intuition, a feeling that the origin of human speech may lie in a land now hidden under water. But when we step into historical linguistics, we must walk softly. Every conclusion demands careful evidence, phonetic comparisons, etymological trails, grammatical structures, and how they evolved across millennia. And the truth is clear: there is no evidence that Tamil or Dravidian is the root of every human language. Yet there are elements in this family that feel ancient enough to make one pause. The stable sound system, the rich layers of suffixation that seem preserved from prehistory, and the profound differences from neighboring languages, almost as if Dravidian did not develop in place, but arrived from somewhere farther away, from the south, where the dream of Kumari Kandam begins. None of this is proof, but together they form a soft bridge between myth and geological possibility. Perhaps there once was a land where the earliest Dravidian communities lived, and perhaps part of that land was drowned by the sea, leaving behind a memory carried in the language they took with them. And what survives in the end is not always stone. Sometimes it is sound. Behind the question, where did language begin, lies an even deeper one. Why did humanity create language at all? Could it be that rising seas, sinking lands, and vanished villages compelled people to name things so they would not be forgotten? Perhaps the very first words were not descriptions of objects, but ways to hold on to emotion, longing, loss, fear, hope, the things we must share in order to survive. When the sea erases a land, humans need stories to keep it alive. When Dogaland, Sunderland, Beringia, or Kumari Kandam slipped into the water, perhaps those memories pushed people to carve meaning into sound, to preserve experience by giving it voice. In this sense, language is not only a tool for communication, it is a soft engraving on the timeline of humanity, a place where memory endures even when geography disappears. And so, even though science cannot prove that human language began in Kumari Kandam, we cannot dismiss the idea as mere myth. It expresses something deeply human, the desire for an origin point, a homeland to anchor our memory, a marker that says, we began here. In the Tamil imagination, that place is Kumari Kandam, where language, culture, and history seem to be reborn each time the story is told. But the story is not finished, because when a culture holds with unwavering devotion the belief that its homeland was swallowed by the sea, science begins to ask another question. Could the Indian Ocean really have witnessed geological upheavals powerful enough to leave a memory this deep? There are lands that never appeared on any map, yet they endure in human memory as if they were once a true homeland. Kumari Kandam is one of those places. No geological trace, no border lines drawn on paper, yet it has lived stubbornly in the Tamil imagination for more than 2,000 years. And between the silence of stone and the echo of poetry, we step into a space where science and myth do not cancel each other out, but illuminate one another. Two different languages speaking the same kind of truth. Science begins with what can be measured. Myth begins with what human beings cannot forget. And sometimes the two paths meet in places no one expects. The Tamil people say that southern India once stretched far into the ocean, only to be swallowed by the sea in 3 great floods. Geology also says, after the last ice age, global sea levels rose more than 120 meters. If wide coastal plains once existed at the southern tip of the Indian subcontinent, they would certainly have been drowned, not once, but in multiple pulses. So even if science cannot confirm an ancient lost continent, it still hints at something important. Something truly was lost. When satellites scan the floor of the Indian Ocean, they do not reveal a complete continent, but a maze of tectonic edges, submerged ridges, and fragments of ancient crust once connected to Gondwana. There is no vanished kingdom the size of a subcontinent beneath the waves. But there are drowned continental shelves, fossilized riverbeds stretching under the sea, and pollen from tropical forests preserved in deep-sea sediment. These findings cannot rebuild the legendary Pandyan realm, yet they quietly affirm what the myths keep repeating. The sea really did take land. And like all memories carried across generations, those coastal losses, once woven into poems, epics, and sacred lore, gradually expanded into a great southern kingdom within cultural imagination. Not because ancient people exaggerated, but because memory needs a shape worthy of the magnitude of loss. But there are parts of the myth that science has not yet learned to touch. In Tamil tradition, there are stories of cities swallowed by the ocean, councils of scholars lost to the waves, and dynasties forced northward as the land sank. These may be memories, metaphors, or literary symbols, but their persistence across thousands of years forces science to ask a deeper question. Why do so many of the world's cultures remember a great rising of the sea? From the Inuit recalling Beringia, to Southeast Asians remembering Sunderland, Europeans recalling Doggerland, and Tamils remembering Kumari Kandam, all echo one truth. The post-Ice Age sea rise was a global experience and humanity did not forget it. So where do science and myth stand in this conversation? Science says there was no continent called Kumari Kandam. Myth replies, but a world of ours was lost. Science says the rocks do not show it. Myth answers, but our hearts remember. Neither is wrong. Neither is completely right. Science describes the surface of truth. Myth describes the depth of emotion and memory. Perhaps the myth was never trying to say that an entire continent sank, but that an entire way of life disappeared, that coastal cultures vanished when the ocean advanced, that a place once called home ceased to exist, and that, in the history of Earth's climate, is entirely possible. What makes this dialogue even more compelling is that the Indian Ocean is far from still. Beneath the waves lie microcontinents like Seychelles, the Kerguelen Plateau that once stood above sea level, and volcanic ridges stretching thousands of kilometers. The southern Indian Ocean is one of the most dynamic, tectonic zones on Earth. So the memory of a once great land is not an absurd idea. It is simply a truth science has not yet fully resolved, and so as geologists continue drilling into the ocean floor and the Tamil people continue reciting their Sangam poems, we find ourselves in a conversation that never truly ends, a conversation between what can be measured and what humanity carries in its memory. There are lands that vanish from the map, yet never vanish from human memory. Kumari Kandam is the clearest example of that paradox. A continent unrecognized by science, unmarked in geology, yet preserved in Tamil literature for thousands of years, as if it had never left at all. Its strangeness does not lie in the fact that the myth exists, but in its endurance. Stronger than politics, stronger than war, stronger than time, and even the deepest cultural shifts. It stands like a half-open door to a past that has never been fully understood. In ancient Tamil texts, especially the Sangam literature, one encounters repeated references to 3 cities swallowed by the sea, a motif echoing like a collective trauma carried across generations. No map shows Kumari Kandam, no chronological record anchors it, yet the core idea never changes. A land was lost, and ancestors once lived there. Works like Silapatikaram or Manimekalai, although not describing Kumari Kandam directly, speak of shorelines retreating inland, floods reshaping kingdoms and communities forced to move to escape the advancing sea. They do not draw geography, they preserve longing. And sometimes longing outlasts stone. The oral tradition is even more vivid. In many Tamil fishing villages, elders say their ancestors came up from beneath the sea, that the ocean was once far away, that where the waves break today was once firm ground. These stories are not told to prove anything. They exist to remind people of an ancient homeland so deeply woven into identity that its memory becomes inseparable from who they are. Tamil children grow up singing about the land to the south. Priests speak of Kumari Nadu as a sacred region. Artists paint cities resting beneath pale blue water. No one asks whether it truly existed. What matters is that it belongs to them. Yet Kumari Kandam lives not only in poetry and folklore, it persists in symbols, in philosophy, and in the way Tamil people define themselves. In their worldview, the south, and the direction where Kumari Kandam is believed to have existed, represents wisdom, awakening, the birthplace of language and art. Kanyakumari, where 3 seas meet, is seen as a threshold between the visible and the invisible. For this reason, Kumari Kandam is not merely a drowned land, it is a spiritual homeland. When physical land disappears, memory becomes territory, and spiritual territory never dies. Science may say Kumari Kandam never existed, but that does not change the way Tamil people live with their myth. For them, the value of a land does not lie solely in rock or topography, but in what the land symbolizes: origin, the flow of language, the first sparks of human creativity. And this leads to a larger question. Do all lost lands in human memory play a similar role in the identity of the cultures that remember them? Doggerland in the memory of Europe, Sunderland in the memory of Southeast Asia, Beringia in the stories of the Inuit, Zealandia in modern archaeology. Each vanished from geography, yet none vanished from remembrance. Viewed together, they reveal that Kumari Kandam is not an outlier. It is part of a global tapestry of memories about worlds claimed by the sea. Tamil myth is simply one thread in a much larger pattern of how humanity remembers the Earth's shifting shape. And from Kumari Kandam, the transition to Atlantis feels as natural as a breath. Because Atlantis, though distant in geography and culture, is also a persistent memory of a world that disappeared. Like Kumari Kandam, it speaks not only of a sunken city, but of deeper loss. The end of a golden age, the transformation of the world, and the grief that generations cannot erase. When we listen to Tamil elders speak of a land swallowed by the sea, and then read Plato's words about a city that vanished in a single day and night, the two stories do not mirror each other, but they resonate with the same tone, the human memory of rising seas and of a world changing too swiftly for ancient people to comprehend. And so, when we leave Kumari Kandam, we are not leaving the realm of memory at all. We are simply stepping from one layer of remembrance into another, toward one of the most enduring legends the world has ever known, Atlantis. Long before Plato wrote two brief passages in Timaeus and Critias, the story of a vanished land may have lived quietly in the nameless tales of early humanity. When people hear the word Atlantis, most think of Plato as the creator of the legend. But if we listen closely, the tale carries a low, ancient rhythm, something that does not feel like philosophy, but like an echo of something older, a memory passed down through voices rather than writing, retold so many times that no one remembers where it truly began. So the question is not, did Plato invent Atlantis, but rather, did the story of a sunken world already exist before him as a fragment of memory from a time when the sea was still reshaping the Earth's coastlines? According to Plato, who attributes the story to Solon, the ancient Egyptians once told the Greeks that they had lost their deep memories because their land was repeatedly destroyed by floods. That suggestion is powerful. Perhaps Greece once had stories of a drowned world, but those stories did not survive the upheavals of time. From that perspective, Atlantis is not an origin, but the one surviving shard of a much older memory. Many scholars believe Plato simply organized the material into a narrative, while the underlying structure, the beautiful land destroyed by a natural catastrophe, was already an ancient motif long before him. And when we look across the Mediterranean, this no longer seems strange at all. The Minoans remembered Thera, an island that exploded into ash, leaving their world torn apart. The Egyptians recorded strange periods when the Nile rose violently and destroyed riverside settlements. The Phoenicians spoke of a land to the west where the sun goes down, swallowed by the sea. Peoples of the Levant told stories of great waves rushing inland. No culture names the same place, yet all describe the same silhouette, a lost world. Atlantis, through this lens, may not be a unique invention, but the Greek name for a pattern of memory shared across the region. Travel eastward, and the memory appears again under different names: Kumari Kandam in Tamil tradition, Rutas in the lore of Indonesia and Sri Lanka, Hawaii in Polynesian ancestry stories, Lemuria in 19th century scientific imagination, itself shaped partly by folk tales of a southern land. different names, different myths, same refrain. The sea took something away. Place all these memories side by side, and it becomes difficult not to see Atlantis as one piece of a global story about how the Earth changed after the Ice Age. When the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose more than 120 meters, nearly every coastal plain on Earth was drowned, from Asia to Europe, from Africa to the Americas. People were forced to abandon lands where they had lived for thousands of years, and the loss was not recorded with writing, but with stories. Stories in which the sea becomes a character, plains become kingdoms, and the sound of waves becomes the anger of gods. In this sense, Atlantis is not an anomaly. It carries the same structure as the myths born from memories of submerged lands. Plato simply used those memories as a backdrop for philosophical dialogue. What is remarkable is that modern archaeology, while not endorsing Atlantis as a literal supercontinent, no longer dismisses the entire idea as absurd. We have found Doggerland beneath the North Sea, Sunderland beneath the Java Sea, Beringia beneath the Bering Strait, and dozens of ancient cities lying on the seafloor of the Mediterranean, Greece, Turkey, and Egypt. The more lost worlds we recover, the less mysterious Atlantis becomes, and the more it resembles the events that truly shaped human history. People lived close to the sea rose, and the world changed faster than memory could keep up. When people speak of Atlantis, what haunts humanity is not only the grandeur of the tale, but the way it vanished, sudden, complete, like a door locked from the outside. But when we widen our view, that disappearance is not an exception at all. The Earth has never been a still stage. It breathes through volcanoes, shifts through earthquakes, and redraws its shorelines the way humans rewrite memory. And when Atlantis, if it ever existed, was swept away, it was not alone. It was only one piece in a long chain of worlds that rose and faded under the same forces that shaped this planet. To understand that, we have to look at the Mediterranean at the end of the Ice Age, a place that seems peaceful today, yet was once a maze of tectonic tension. Plates slid past each other, faults stretched beneath the sea, and volcanoes waited for the slightest change in pressure. Santorini, with its crescent-shaped caldera, is the clearest reminder. Around 1600 before the Common Era, the eruption of Thera released energy hundreds of times greater than modern explosives, sending tsunamis across Crete, destroying ports, and shaking the foundations of the Minoan civilization. In a matter of hours, a world was reshaped. And suddenly, Plato's idea of one day and one night of misfortune no longer sounds mythical. It sounds like testimony, either witnessed or passed down through generations. But a world does not need a volcano to disappear. Rising seas are more than enough. When the Ice Age ended, global sea levels rose more than 120 meters, enough to swallow every coastal plain where prehistoric people once lived. Doggerland vanished from northern Europe, Sunderland slipped beneath the Java Sea, Beringia dissolved into the Northern Ocean. North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Near East once extended tens of kilometers farther outward. People did not live on mountain ridges. They lived in river mouths, fertile valleys, and coastal plains. They lived exactly where the sea would take first. If a real Atlantis ever existed, it most likely lay in such places, beautiful but fragile regions now reduced to silt and stone beneath blue water. Geology sharpens this picture even more. During the Ice Age, Mediterranean sea levels were dozens of meters lower than today. Vast plains now submerged once connected islands, peninsulas, and coastlines. As the ice melted, water poured through the Strait of Gibraltar like a global waterfall, raising the Mediterranean rapidly. Villages, fields, and harbours went under within a handful of generations. If people once lived on an Atlantis, somewhere in the Aegean, along North Africa, or near Iberia, they would have watched the sea advance day after day like a cold hand reaching across their land with no force on earth able to stop it. Plato's story then becomes less mystical and more like a memory condensed into narrative form. When we place Atlantis into the global pattern, we see it for what it is, not different from Doggerland, not different from Beringia, not different from Sunderland. It is not the only civilization wiped from the map, not the singular tragedy of one people. It is a chapter in the Earth's larger book, a book in which every place ever called home eventually disappears if the climate shifts strongly enough. The forces that erase civilizations are not mysterious or supernatural. They are familiar to tectonic drift, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, melting ice, rising seas, the same forces that tore apart Pangaea, hurled India into Asia, lifted the Himalayas into the sky, drowned Zealandia, and cracked apart fragments remembered as Lemuria. And because of that, when we look back at Atlantis, the important question is not what destroyed it, but understanding that whatever destroyed it was part of a natural rhythm, the same rhythm that swallowed Doggerland, reshaped Sunderland, and consumed Beringia. Atlantis is not unique in its loss. It is unique because its story survived in writing. Many other worlds also vanished, but their memories dissolved into folklore, while Atlantis was preserved by Plato's philosophy, a final bright note in the symphony of drowned lands. And once we realize Atlantis was not alone, we begin to see something else. Perhaps Plato was not describing a specific city at all, but a pattern, a rhythm of the earth that every civilization must eventually face. One day, the sea will rise again, volcanoes will erupt again, the ground will move beneath us again. The story of Atlantis is not a warning from the past. It is a quiet reminder that the fragility of humanity has always lived right beneath our feet, no matter how many cities or empires we build upon them. When we speak of Doggerland, Sunderland, Beringia, Zealandia, Lemuria, Kumari Kandam, or Atlantis, it's easy to imagine each as an isolated story, its own tragedy, its own time, its own people. But when we step back and look at the planet as a living organism shifting over millions of years, a repeating shape begins to emerge. As if all these lost lands, though separated by half the earth, are simply variations of the same breath, the rise and fall, the swelling and retreat, the endless expansion and contraction of the earth itself. The earth has never been still. Its crust drifts constantly, pushing and pulling like great wooden rafts, floating on molten stone. Where one plate slides beneath another, volcanoes form. Where two plates pull apart, oceans open, and where plates collide, mountains rise before sinking again. Doggerland vanished under melting ice, Sunderland disappeared beneath rising seas, Zealandia subsided along the Pacific plate, Beringia drowned in a warming climate, and Atlantis, if it ever existed, could not have escaped these same laws. When these places are plotted on a geological map, the truth becomes plain. Every lost continent is a natural outcome of planetary forces, not of magic or curses. But geology is only half of the story. The other half belongs to humans, those who lived on these lands, grew from them, and were forced to leave them behind. Each time the sea rose, people migrated. and every migration left behind 3 layers of memory: genetic memory, cultural memory, and mythic memory. The ancestors of Southeast Asia carry traces of Sundaland. The ancestors of the Americas passed through Beringia. Ancient Europeans lived on Doggerland. The people of Madagascar bear a blend of Southeast Asian and African ancestry, like residual footprints of prehistoric voyages. In our DNA, there are pieces of drowned worlds. In culture, those memories appear as stories that echo one another without ever meeting. The Inuits speak of grasslands swallowed by the sea. Polynesians remember Hawaii. The Tamil people tell of Kumari Kandam. The Greeks preserved Atlantis. Indonesians recall ancient Java. Europeans speak of Doggerland, and Vietnamese tales describe the ocean pushing deep into lowland plains. These places are far apart, their languages distant, their eras unconnected, yet they all tell the same pattern. There was once a beautiful world that vanished, and our ancestors walked upon it. Over hundreds of generations, those memories transformed into mythology. A plain became a kingdom, a valley became a capital, a family line became a dynasty, a rising sea became a great flood. Not because ancient people were superstitious, but because they needed a story large enough to hold the weight of their loss, the loss of a land they believed belonged to them. When we place all these stories side by side, they no longer feel like separate events. They begin to form repeating pieces of a single pattern. The earth always changes, and every civilization, no matter how mighty, stands on borrowed ground. The positions of Doggerland and Sundaland, those vast prehistoric coastal plains, correspond today with some of the most densely populated cities on Earth: Bangkok, Jakarta, Shanghai, New York, Alexandria. The places that collapsed in prehistory are the very places humanity continues to build upon. We are not as different from our ancestors as we imagine. We have simply gained the ability to see what lies ahead. But the common thread is not only scientific, it lives in the way humans remember. Through memories so durable, they outlast stone and water alike. No continent lives forever on the surface of the earth, but these places live on in stories, in symbols, in songs, in languages, in bedtime legends, and in the question humanity never stops asking: where did we come from? Lost lands, whether real or mythical, have become mirrors reflecting backward into time, reminding us that the only true permanence is the memory we choose to keep. And when we gather all of these echoes, Doggerland, Sundaland, Beringia, Kumarikandam, Lemuria, Atlantis, we find they all lead to one question: what happens when land disappears? What do humans carry with them? And from the fragments that remain, who do we become? When we look at a modern map, the world appears so complete it's almost deceptive. The oceans seem to sit exactly where oceans should, and the continents look as if they have rested in those shapes since the beginning of time. But the Earth has never been fixed. It shifts, fractures, rises and sinks like a living giant, taking long, slow breaths. Vast regions that once existed and later vanished are not rare at all. And sometimes, when we stand on a shoreline today, we are actually standing on the edge of an older world, one where ancient people once walked barefoot, built fires, sang songs, and named the winds and waters on ground, now buried beneath deep blue waves. Geography may forget them, but people do not. Across every culture, no matter how far apart, there are stories that do not belong to the land we see today. It's as if every people carries a memory of a homeland that disappeared, a plain devoured by the sea, a world that no longer exists, and strangely, These memories endured even without writing, without maps, without chronicles. They traveled by other routes, through legend, through song, through ritual, through DNA, through customs, preserved long after the reason behind them was forgotten. The Polynesians speak of Hawaii, the ancestral homeland, where the sun rises from the sea, a place no one can point to on a map. The Tamil people remember Kumari Kandam, the southern land that nourished the Dravidian world. Europeans carry scattered memories of a plain swallowed by the North Sea, Doggerland. Peoples of the Americas and Northeast Asia recall the great grassland that once linked Siberia and Alaska, Beringia. Southeast Asians preserve stories of a homeland drowned beneath what is now the Java Sea, the memory of Sunderland. These lands did not share locations, eras, or languages, yet the memory of a missing homeland is astonishingly similar across them all. And in that realization we see that when we speak of lost continents, we are not only talking about geography, we are talking about humanity. Today, genetic science reveals what legend could only express through metaphor. The DNA of Madagascar carries traces of ancient journeys from Borneo and Sumatra, an ocean crossing spanning thousands of kilometers. In the genes of First Nations peoples in Alaska and Canada lie the signatures of ancestors who lived in Beringia more than 15,000 years ago, a land now drowned. In sediments from England and Denmark, we find footprints of Mesolithic people who once walked across the forests of Doggerland. In the genomes of Southeast Asia, we see branches diverging from valleys that now lie beneath the South China Sea. These cold data points speak the same truth as ancient stories. Our ancestors truly lived on lands that no longer exist. And those memories live not only in genes, but in rituals. The Tamil Konakal chants the Polynesian haka, Inuit songs about the endless opening of the sea. They are like small doorways into lands without names. Languages preserve words about rising water and collapsing soil. Poetry preserves the ache of a home swallowed by waves. Ritual preserves the silhouette of ancient voyages. Folklore repeats the image of a beautiful land reclaimed by the gods. And slowly, that memory grows larger than the land that once held it. Atlantis is not just a place, it is a symbol of longing. Doggerland is more than a drowned plain. It is a reminder of how fragile every coastal home is. Sundaland is not just a submerged continent, it is a bridge our ancestors crossed. Lemuria, Kumari Kandam, Hawaii, whether real or not, prove that humans always need a way to hold on to what has been lost, to whisper, "We were there once." There is something strange and beautiful about this. Sometimes longing keeps a land alive longer than the land itself. Geology cannot preserve Doggerland, but collective memory has. The sea may have swallowed Sunderland, but the bloodlines of its people still carry it. No one can see Beringia now, yet every person in the Americas carries its shadow. Kumari Kandam may not be confirmed by archaeology, but it survives through poetry, legend, and Tamil pride. A continent can die on a map, but it only truly dies when no one remembers it. And that moment, so far, has never come. And when we look back across the entire journey from Doggerland to Sunderland, from Beringia to Kumari Kandam, from Lemuria to Atlantis, we begin to understand that lost lands were never only geography. They are our history, the mark of humanity's earliest footsteps, the shared longing that ties us all together. When memory grows larger than geography, it becomes the only continent that truly endures, one the ocean can never drown. When we reach the far end of this long journey past mist-covered Doggerland, sunlit Sunderland, the hazy dream of Lemuria, the blue immensities of Zealandia, the icy winds of Beringia, the shimmering myth of Kumari Kandam, and the ancient question mark of Atlantis, a gentle but profound truth begins to rise. No continent ever truly disappears. It simply steps away from the surface and finds refuge in human memory. These lands once held sunlight, footprints, laughter, fear. Places where our ancestors lived and loved now rest beneath ocean floors, beneath layers of lava, beneath beds of sediment. And yet they remain alive in the things humanity chooses to remember. If we listen long enough, we hear this truth in every legend. The Polynesians speak of Hawaii as if it still lingers just below the horizon. The Tamil people recall Kumari Kandam as the beating heart of Dravidian culture. Inuit elders remember a warm northern land before the sea rose. The Greeks carry the shadow of Atlantis across their waves. Europeans whisper Doggerland's name when gazing toward the North Sea. Southeast Asians tell stories of Sunderland swallowed by rising waters. Every story speaks of loss, but at the same time, each story speaks of a stubborn, enduring effort to keep what was lost from ever being forgotten. When we look deeper into DNA, we find that these lands do not live only in stories, they live inside us. Genetic traces of ancient Beringians remain in millions across the Americas. The blood of Sunderland's people still flows through most of Southeast Asia. Mesolithic echoes remain in modern Europeans. And in Madagascar, half of the ancestry comes from boats that once crossed the Java Sea, evidence of a world far more connected than today's maps suggest. The Earth may shift, but the human body is a memory chest. It carries the journeys of thousands of generations, even when the land beneath their feet is gone. In culture, those memories flicker like small flames that never quite go out. Dances that mimic the waves, ceremonies honoring water, poems about homes sinking below the sea, songs mourning a land erased from the surface. None of these are accidents. They are humanity's way of resisting oblivion, for land can be lost, but if a story is still told, then a piece of that land survives. If a dance is still passed down, the spirit of the old world still breathes. If a people still carry a name shaped by the ocean, then their vanished home will never fully disappear. Here, the sunken continents teach us a soft but steadfast lesson. No land is permanent, but memory outlasts geology. Doggerland vanished 8,000 years ago, yet it lives in archaeology and European imagination. Sunderland drowned 10,000 years ago, yet it survives in Southeast Asian DNA. Lemuria and Kumari Kandam may not exist in geological terms, but they live powerfully in Tamil identity. Zealandia lies under the Pacific, yet science is slowly calling it back into view. Beringia rests beneath the sea, yet millions of people carry its imprint. Atlantis, real or not, lives on as a metaphor for every world humanity has lost. A land truly disappears only when no one remembers it, and that moment so far has never come. And then we realize human history did not begin with writing, nor with pyramids or fortified walls. It began with people who survived changes greater than any empire, melting ice, rising seas, erupting volcanoes, quaking ground, vast migrations. That chapter of history isn't written on stone or paper. It lives in the unspoken memory of our species, in the lands that disappeared, yet were never forgotten. In the end, we understand that the sunken continents are not geography at all. They are the map of human consciousness. They remind us how resilient our ancestors were, how they adapted, how they rebuilt the world every time the earth shifted beneath them. And among all the continents that rose and sank, one remains with us always, the continent of memory. It cannot be drowned by the ocean, torn by earthquakes, or worn away by time. It is where all lost lands gather, where stories find shelter, where longing takes shape. And there, the true journey of humanity begins, not on the map, but in the heart. When this long journey finally reaches its end, we look back at the path we've walked, not a straight line, but a wide arc, curving around worlds that once existed and then disappeared. We began in mist-covered Doggerland, crossing Mesolithic plains where people followed herds in the pale light of dawn. We followed the waves that rose into Europe, then drifted south toward warm Sunderland, where the ancestors of millions once lived beside rivers now buried beneath the sea. We moved through the remembered homelands of Polynesia, drifted between the blurred edges of Lemuria where science and myth once brushed against each other, then sank into the deep blue shadow of Zealandia. We crossed the cold winds of Beringia, heard the distant echoes of ancient tribes, then stepped into the Tamil heartland where Kumari Kandam endures as a memory as steady as the culture itself. And at the end, we opened the door to Atlantis, not to find a vanished city, but to understand the longing passed through generations for worlds that slipped beneath the waves. Looking back, we realized that throughout this journey, we were not moving through places. We were moving through a 10,000-year silence where history has no voice, but memory never stopped breathing. If we listen closely enough, we can hear the heartbeat of an age without writing. An age when people built their homes on vast coastal plains, when a single river could sustain an entire community and could vanish within a few generations as the oceans rose. It was a time when the Earth's upheavals, volcanoes, earthquakes, encroaching seas, were not recorded in text, but in human movement. People walked, they crossed the ocean, they carried children, tools, languages, rituals, and a quiet ache in their hearts. That silence was never empty. It was simply a pause where history left no written marks, yet carved itself into the bodies and spirits of humankind. What we call civilization only appeared after all of this. After Doggerland vanished, after Sunderland dissolved into the sea, after Beringia was split apart, after the homelands of millions survived only through legend. This leads to a gentle but profound thought. Before civilization, humans lived through stories far bigger than any civilization could ever record. When we touch sediment lifted from the seafloor, we touch an age without a name. When we hold a Mesolithic spearhead, we place our hand inside the hand of someone who lived 10,000 years ago on a land now hidden beneath waves. When we trace the branches of DNA, we follow footsteps across continents that no longer exist. And when we listen to the stories of Polynesians, Tamils, Inuit elders, ancient Greeks, we hear memories that survived across hundreds of generations. That 10,000-year silence was never erased. It is simply the part of history modern people are least accustomed to seeing, because we look for writing rather than memory. But our ancestors preserved their past in other ways, through myth, ritual, migration, customs, genetics, and the repeated whisper that a land was taken by the sea. These memories outlast the land itself, longer than stone, older than any map. And so when we look back at the entire journey, we understand that the goal was never to prove or disprove a mythic continent, The goal was to see that humanity walked through the twilight of geology before stepping into the daylight of civilization. Before Mesopotamia, before pyramids, before writing, before walls and cities, there was a far older story, the story of lost lands and the people who learned to survive when the ground beneath them changed. We, alive today, are only the newest chapter in a journey that began on worlds modern maps no longer remember. We stand on the memory of Doggerland, Sunderland, Beringia, Kumari Kandam, Atlantis, Lemuria. Even if they are gone, they still carry us forward. So what is this 10,000-year silence? It is not a missing section of history. It is the long breath between geology and culture, a place where humans learned how to become themselves, how to adapt, how to remember, how to tell stories, and how to be reborn each time the earth changed. This silence is a mirror reflecting our ancestors in the moments they faced the planet's immense forces. And when we look into it, we see ourselves more clearly. We see why humans tell stories, why we search for origins, why we ask where we come from. And when the journey finally closes, one image remains. A person standing at the edge of the sea, staring across the horizon, carrying within them the memory of worlds that have drifted away. Those continents may no longer appear on any map, but they remain within us, in the stories we tell, in the blood we carry, in the quiet gaze we cast toward our beginnings. Perhaps that is where every civilization truly begins, not on the land, but inside the memory of a species that has never forgotten the worlds that sank,